Thanks for tuning in to The Leadership Beat, a Bates Communications original podcast series exploring leadership trends and inspiring leaders to innovate and think differently.
Hi, and welcome to The Leadership Beat, a Bates Communication original podcast series. I am Michael Seitchik, the Director of Research and Assessment at Bates, and today I am joined by Dr. Gregory Shea. Greg consults, researches, writes, and teaches in the areas of organizational and individual change, group effectiveness, and conflict resolution. Actually, I've known Greg for about 30 years, and I will not go over all his titles and positions because this is a short podcast. He's got a long list of accomplishments. But just to name a few, he is the adjunct professor of management at the Wharton School, also teaches in Wharton's Aresi Institute of Executive Education, and is a longtime senior fellow at Wharton's Center for Leadership and Change Management. So welcome, Greg.
Greetings.
He also has numerous articles and several books, including Leading Successful Change, which he co-authored with Cassie Solomon. And he also co-authored with Robert Gunther a book, Your Job Survival Guide, which we will talk about a little bit today. So, Greg, we're looking forward to hearing your perspective on how leaders should think differently as they navigate today's challenging, ever-changing environment. So first, I'd like to focus on leading and working in a world of constant change. In your book, Your Job Survival Guide, you discuss how in today's world of constant change, everyone, regardless of their title or responsibility, is really leading change in some way. In fact, you talk a lot about the fact that leaders face an environment of permanent whitewater. So in the book, you talk about the skills necessary to thrive in an environment of constant change. Could you explain what you mean by permanent whitewater, and then share some tips on what leaders can do to help people navigate the permanent whitewater environment?
Sure. So the phrase permanent whitewater actually comes from Peter Vail, and it refers to the world where change is the constant, which is a different reality than was the reality in the middle and into the latter part of the 20th century. And then slowly industry after industry got deregulated, exposed to globalization, wave upon wave of technological change. So the notion of permanent whitewater, which is from the kayaking world, is the notion that you're continually in change. And you don't move from the model that was explicit before, and I think in many ways is implicit today, which is that you're in a world where you go from steady state through the perturbation of change and then back into some kind of steady state, where in fact, permanent whitewater, you're continually in change. And the question is just to stay with the river metaphor, how white's the water today? But you're always in a world of change. And the original title of the book was Your Real Job is Change. And I think the implication of that world for people who are leaders, but people really at almost any level in the organization, is just that your real job becomes change, that change becomes a core competency of the organization or not, and it becomes a core competency of the individuals in it or not. And one can find that the cues about that reality are long-standing now, which include just go to a job and see how fast they start talking to you about have you ever, and it tends to be, have you ever put in a new information system? Have you ever handled an acquisition? Have you ever spun off? Have you ever combined offices? Have you ever opened a new office? Have you opened a new strategic business unit? All those are change. That's what they are.
And so in this world of permanent whitewater, what can either a leader do or, well, let's start with a leader. So what can a leader do in leading that and also managing his or her team of folks?
Well, I think the first thing is just and it sounds patently obvious, but accept that that's the reality. If you don't have the right mindset, then the tips or kind of the cheat sheet one would give you to carry around, the checklist, doesn't make a lot of sense. So the mindset is, do you believe that that's the world that you're in?
Yeah, I know when I'm coaching folks and they're going through a lot of change, they say, "Oh, I can't wait till it's over." And I say, "Well, I got some bad news for you.
Exactly.
It's going to get worse.
Right.
It's just going to speed up even more."
So I think that is exactly the first step for anyone, and particularly for leaders, is that you're in trouble when you're saying just get through today, or just get through this week, or then it becomes this month or this quarter or this year, and you've crossed into the great denial arena when you say this decade, we get through this decade, and I'm telling you the next one, well, no, it's not. It's not. The water might be more or less white at any given time, but it doesn't change the fact about the change. So I think that's the first piece, which then leads to the implication both for the organization but also for individuals, which is the need to pace oneself in the organization and not to trust the environment to do that. We're organic, biologic entities, and if you don't respect that and you treat this as if, to mix metaphors, you're running a marathon as a series of sprints, it's not a question of winning or not. You don't finish the race. They find you draped over the hood of a Volvo, right, and hook you up to IVs. So the first thing is the mindset, I think. The second implication of that is the conscious attempt to impose pace as far as possible, which, staying with the metaphor, you don't run a big river. You don't get at the top of the Snake River in March and say, I'm going to run the river. No, you don't, because the river's too big, too strong. You have to slice it into pieces, and you have to impose a pace on the river if you have any hope of being able to finish it.
So what can someone do if their boss says, that's nice, I want you to work faster anyway? In other words, you're trying to manage the pace, but you're being pushed to go faster, go down the river, whatever metaphor you want to use. What can someone do without getting fired?
Well, part of it is certainly can raise the question about pacing over time, and what do you think we're going to be doing in 3 months or 6 months, or what do you expect the unit to be able to do when we're done with this? In the book, I've got an example of a very experienced CIO who ended up giving time off to a project team in advance of the project because he knew he couldn't deliver on a promise because he didn't know what the world was going to be like at the end of the project, right? That's an enlightened senior person. But in the absence of that is, what do you think the world's going to be like, and how do we make sure these people, what's the next assignment for this group? What should we be doing to prepare them so they can do that work, not just this work? And frankly, in the end, if you're working, all kinds of abusive bosses. And if a boss thinks that the answer to everything is run faster, work harder, look for another job. I'm being a little flippant about that, but there are bosses out there, as I just indicated, who get it. That doesn't mean people aren't working hard. It doesn't mean that a marathon isn't a serious piece of competition and work. But again, you can't handle it like a sprint. And so the upward pressure is, we've got to pace ourselves over time. What do you want this group to be able to do next? And if you cannot get any traction with somebody like that over time, there are people there in all kinds of levels who view the people who report to them as expendable. If they view you as expendable, you view them as expendable.
So kind of tell me if this is accurate. So one of the things I'm hearing you say, particularly when you first started talking about this, was you need to tell the truth to people. In other words, be authentic. Like, this is going to be hard. This is, it's kind of not going to end, but we're going to pace this out. Is that something that what you would advise leaders to do?
Yes, and I think one of the things about being truthful in a permanent whitewater world is that the nature of truth changes. And what I mean by that is, if we're in a reasonably stable environment, you should be able to point out pretty much what you think the XY coordinates are of where you're going to be, and whether it's 6 months or 3 years, depending upon your level, that you can point and say, this is where we're going to be. The most likely thing in a permanent whitewater world, if you do that, you're wrong. So why would you tell people that, right? You can tell people we're headed northeast, we're headed to a service line structure, or we're headed southwest, we're headed to a regional expansion. That's for the following reasons. And when they say, well, what is that going to look like in a couple? I don't know yet, right? I know that we've made the following choices about what we're not going to do. This is a direction. Here's the basic skeleton of what we're trying to do. But if I try to provide you and me with some type of false assurance about what the world's going to look like, the most likely thing that's going to be true is that's not true. So now where am I? You, as the person who report to me, you either decide I'm incompetent or I lied to you. Neither one of these is going to help my leadership relationship with you, right? So.
Okay, well, good. So I want to switch gears a little bit, and I'd like to go to the topic of innovation. Just like everyone is somehow in the midst of constant change, the need to innovate is also pervasive. So both leaders and teams often struggle with the elements that are involved in innovation, and related to what we were just talking about with change is, senior executives always want the innovation to happen faster. Right? So you recently co-authored an article in the Sloan Management Review with George Day, who's also from Wharton, about the importance of how people talk about innovation. You say that how people in an organization talk about innovation is critical to understanding how to make innovation happen faster. And we all want to make it happen faster. So in the Bates team assessment, one of our facets, the communications facet, is in part based on research that shows to increase your chances that change will be successful is to start by changing the narrative, changing how people talk about the organization, their team, themselves, and themselves as individuals. Is that in line with your experience and your research? Can you talk about a little bit about the role narrative plays in innovation?
So, of course.
Just wrote the article.
That's right. So the use of narrative, there's several different uses of it. One is diagnostic. So if you go and ask people to tell you stories about how innovation happens or doesn't happen in this organization, that's very diagnostic of the place. So people say, oh, well, we do innovation. But the first thing is you've got to secure your current base, and we put our best people on our biggest clients, right? Always. Well, those are not consistent with someone who's got a narrative that's about organic growth and innovation.
Explain that. Yeah.
Well, if you're really interested in innovation, which is primarily the biggest reason for it is to drive organic growth inside the organization. If I'm putting my best people on the biggest clients, I should be putting some set of those best people on the smallest projects that have the biggest potential impact if one thought about innovation on them. I'm not interested in securing the base, right? I'm interested in expanding or altering, right? And part of that is being very practical about trying to fuel cannibalization of your own product. Well, that's not just corporate speak. That has to do with the word I put my talent, right? So that would be an example of making a decision as a leader about are you interested in this quarter, or are you interested in what's going to happen in terms of organic growth over time. So narrative in the first instance is diagnostic. In the second instance, it's in terms of some other writing of them, work systems and trying to create environments to drive change, is what do you want the narrative to be, right? What is it that what would it look like? You want to be an innovative organization? What's happening in the organization? What are the stories of innovation that are happening, that are not currently happening, but that would be happening? And then that becomes, if one buys the notion that if those stories are not happening currently, it's probably not because you hired all the non-innovative people on the planet. It probably has something to do with the way you set up your organization. So how would I have to set up the organization to make these narratives make sense to people as a way to live out their time at work? And so the use of narrative, it's two different things. One is I use it as diagnostic about, do I have a current culture, a current set of predictable behaviors that are supportive of innovation? And then secondly, if I'm trying to construct a world, what should innovation look like? And therefore, how should I be changing the organization to drive a narrative that does not currently exist?
So in the article, you talk about organizations tend to have either a growth affirming or a growth denying narrative. So what would a growth affirming narrative look like? What would it feel like?
Well, and we at least mention in the article, although we present it in more in a binary sense, like with most heuristics, they don't really survive contact with reality intact, right? So there's a whole bunch of gray zone in there, but it's clear about emphasis. Growth affirming narratives would be, people would be able to tell you, so I know someone who has had an idea for changing the following business. And it's amazing around here how fast you can find a sponsor for that stuff. And the money shows up immediately to get it done. Boy, they're tough about measurement because they're immediately talking about wanting to make sure that you follow the protocols we have. They immediately are on you about making sure that there's a customer potential out there for this, but you've got a lot of latitude to develop the idea. You've got lots of support. It happens amazingly quickly. It gets vetted in a regularly and in a disciplined fashion, but you don't have any trouble finding resources around here if you've got an idea that looks like it might have some legs and then it's developed over time. That would be either one that currently would be a growth affirming, or that's what we want people to say, is we want people to say, this is how it works. Person A has an idea and bang,
right.
These cylinders start firing in order to make it happen for you.
It's not unusual when I'm coaching someone, either around something like this or vision, they say, well, what do I do if my organizational culture is not, growth affirming? What can I do? Is there anything I can do with me and my team? In other words, if I can't change the whole organization, so are there things that people can do, in their own positions without waiting for the entire culture to change?
So one of the things that you and I both know about organizations is that organizations are filled with microcultures. That's just the way any culture is, that you can say this is the overall culture and it has these kinds of dimensions and it tends to play itself out in the following ways. And then you go to a particular part of the organization and that's true, but it's not true because there's some local derivation of that, right? And I think one of the real and ongoing challenges for leaders at any level is to create the kind of, to use the manufacturing image, the kind of shop you want to have. And that's always been true for leaders. What's it like to work for this person doing this work at this time, which may be well insulated from the rest of the organization, or maybe not. Maybe it actually flows easily into the rest of the organization. So in terms of what things to do, I think it would take us back to just smaller versions of the same work, which would be, what do we want to be like to work in this unit? What do you need to do that? Is the information that you need there to do that? What am I rewarding as a leader? And it's not just money. There are a variety of ways. I mean, I've worked with people who are second and third level who create both peer group rewards and recognition rewards of exposing people to more senior places, positions, based on their work internally. Worked with a guy in a shop who went out with his own money and bought T-shirts that people wore when they did the T-shirt mattered, but the bigger part was they knew it came out of his pocket. So this guy is investing himself in trying to get a different way of operating embedded in this part of a huge organization, right? So I think all the standard things around information measurement, rewards, who gets to decide what, do you have protocols for the kind of work that you want to do? And don't just say we want to be innovative. If all you do is say the words and you don't change the systems that drive people's behavior, even in your piece of the world, then what you're asking people to do is change behavior when the world around them hasn't changed. And people generally figure that's a pretty dumb idea.
Okay. Well, that leads nicely to what I know is your bread and butter, your work systems model. So in other words, you just said, if you're fighting kind of a system, that makes it pretty hard. So to look at change or trying to implement innovation from more of a systemic point of view, and you're trying to change behavior, kind of, could you go a little bit into your model? Because I know that historically, change initiatives fail 70 to 90% of the time, depending on which article you read, but it's not good. And I know your track record is much, much better in terms of implementing successful change with organizations. So, what can either an individual leader do or an organization do to make sure change and innovation have a better chance of being successfully implemented?
Well, in the and I'll try to keep this to under a week here as I talk about my life's work. I'll try to, so if I proposed in the work systems model, and Cassie and I wrote about it in the Leading Successful Change book, is that there are 8 elements that produce the environment at work, and that those elements create the cues that we as human beings are very good at recognizing. So everything from organization, which is lines and boxes and meeting schedules, to what kind of training or skills do you have, who do you bring in, to what kind of protocols or pathways are laid out, to what kind of workspace do you have, which includes what kind of tools you're using in that space. As we mentioned, what are reward, both pluses, both rewards and punishment. What do you measure, and what information do you get access to? Is it pushed toward you? Do you have to go pull it? And what are decisions allocation or RACI charting, which is what's your involvement and what kind of decisions? Those are local. So while corporate can do things that sets those up, an individual leader influences and may actually be able to control considerable pieces of that, especially once you move up past the first or second level of management. They have lots of control over that. So if one thinks about trying to construct the local environment, it's not just the words that you speak and the things that you do, which matter. It's how do you think about those sets of influences that'll be there whether you're standing with the person or you're not standing with the person, those sets of cues.
Right. Well, obviously, I'm pretty familiar with the model.
You're a better person for that, Michael.
Absolutely. So my wife says every day, if it wasn't for that model, you'd be no good. So I know one of the things you found through your experience is that, so you have these 8 buttons.
Mm-hmm.
There's rewards, there's training, etc. There's structure. So from what I remember, you found that unless you push kind of 3 or 4 of those buttons at once, change is not going to happen. Could you speak a little bit about that and what your experience has been?
Well, the bigger the change that you're trying to get to have happen. So we go back to this notion of want to change from an organization that's largely about leveraging what it has currently to really putting a lot of emphasis on innovation, even disruptive innovation that might cannibalize its own current markets in pursuit of what comes next. You want the clinical test on this would be people whose behavior you're trying to change need to have a sense that the world around them has changed. So in general, the general guideline that I'd give out would be that you want to change at least 4 of these in a notable fashion, so that people have a sense that I'm no longer, living in the Sahara. I'm now living at 6,000 feet in a forested area. I better change the way that I'm going to go. And as a species, we're really good at doing that, but we have to come to the recognition that, in fact, I'm no longer where I was. For me, one of the great quotes about this would be Google's quote about, we hire people who don't need support and then we support them. That's exactly the model, right? So you want innovation, get people in there who have the basic skills around conceptualization, be able to think differently, et cetera. And you get them in there, but you embed them in a system that's been designed to really support them. So we hire people who don't need support, and then we support them.
That's great.
Right.
All right. Well, obviously, Greg, we could go on for several more hours and days.
Well, we can just end the podcast, and you and I can keep talking. We can do that.
So if people want to know more about your change model, your work systems approach, I suggest that they go to your website, which is Gregory Shea, one word, .com. And people will also can find some short videos there that give examples and explain your approach to change. And of course, people can sign up for your newsletter. So
they can, and there's also at Wharton, there are Knowledge at Wharton. They can go in there, and there are those podcasts and different versions and user-friendly versions of what we've talked about here today.
All right. Well, thanks, Greg, for
my
a really
pleasure.
stimulating conversation.
Good to see you.
Thank you.